Just before you do that, can I just, Maria, she's new coordinator, and so she's got her camera on so you can see her. And she just started a month ago. She's awesome. So that's great for me because I'm the hub manager in Quebec. And among other things. So yeah, so this is her first time at an ALUS meeting. And Maria, this is going to be a great call because Kevin's going over some pretty simple sort of standard material like the classification scheme and data, or Casey and Kevin. So welcome aboard. Welcome to the family.
Welcome.
Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be part of this team. Yeah, I really get to know you better. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Lynn. Hi, Maria. Hi, everyone. I'm going to start by going through a slide deck here, which I apologize we didn't get sent out ahead of time, but we will send it out today. And then, like Paige said, so I'm going to go through a slide deck and some information, and then actually Alyssa is going to do kind of a live example in the database system. So the first part of the call is more information and not specifically tied to the database, but relates to the information you need to put in. So that's talking about the classifications. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback right now. Is anybody else? One might need to mute.
Yeah, I would just mute yourself if you're not already muted.
Thank you. Okay, so let's just dive right in. So ALUS project classification scheme. Let's see if my PowerPoint works. There we go. So this is what we're going to go through today. I'm going to review, what is a classification scheme? Why is it important? What are we even talking about? Where can you find reference materials so that you can refer to it in your day-to-day and while you're working? And then I'm actually going to go through the classification scheme in a bit of detail, and then relate that to how this information relates to when you're putting information into the database. And then Alyssa will do an example in the live database, and then we'll take questions. So what is a classification scheme and why is it important? So when we're referring to the classification scheme, what we're talking about is essentially the backbone of how our project data is collected in the database system. Collected, organized, all that sort of back-end stuff. So the classification scheme is what we use to categorize projects into various subgroups based on the project properties and their characteristics and their location and that sort of thing. So it's a fairly robust classification scheme, which, don't worry, we're going to go into quite in detail. So why is it like that? So when we developed the database years ago, way back like 2014, 2015, we really looked at, okay, what are the different types of projects that are going on? How could we potentially need to filter this information in the future to support various needs? And we tried to make the classification scheme detailed enough that we'd be able to pick out sort of those nuances depending on our needs down the road. And kudos to the original database development team because they have done a really great job of making these classifications, and it suited our needs for a very long time. We've made a few additions here and there, but generally has been really great. And the main power that this gives us is that it means that within the database, the records can be filtered and sorted and searched through various reporting and whatnot to based on these classifications and these different criteria that projects have been identified as. And that allows us all kinds of data analysis power. Predominantly, the main use that we use for it is for our fund development purposes. So both reporting back to funders on what type of projects their funding has supported with a level of detail that the funders really appreciate. And also it helps us know what's in our system so that we can seek more funds. So, if a funder comes to us and says, we have a really keen interest in, you know, native grasslands in this part of the world. Do you have those? We can go into our system and the database, and we can search the records based on this classification scheme, and we can pull out and know exactly what we have in across the ALUS system that fits that criteria. So it's incredibly powerful, and we use it a lot. And also it can, on your end, you can use those same properties for your local fundraising, or you know, reports back to your legal entity and those sort of things on what type of projects you're doing, what is the interest in your farm community, like what are your farmers interested in, and all those kinds of things. So that's what the classification scheme is, and why we have it. We wanted to have this call today and go over this at a database meeting as a refresher. Like I said, this classification scheme has existed since the beginning of time. So our, you know, more experienced database users are probably quite familiar with this. It's kind of second nature to do your drop downs or whatever, but it's good to get a refresher and some clarification on what some of the different things mean. And that's what we're going to go into in detail. So first of all, I'm going to be looking at a few different documents today as we go through this. So right off the bat, just letting you know that these documents are available to you guys for your day-to-day work, and they can be found in the cookbook by going to the database section of the cookbook, and then it has its own folder, ALUS classification scheme, and the document can be found in there. I'm going to review the PDF document first. You probably won't look at that on your day-to-day work. The main reference material that you're going to want to look at is the Excel document, the ALUS classification scheme named document, and I'll show you that in a couple slides. But I'll go through the structure first because it can help understand sort of the workflow. So this is just a flow chart here, and there's, when you're putting in project data, there's sort of 4 categories, 4 independent structures that you have to select. The activity, the land class, the main function, and the project description. And within each of those 4 categories, the data is tiered. So whatever you choose for the first selection will impact what options you have for the second selection. And whatever you choose for the second selection will impact what options you have for the third selection. So this is really important to know, and why I wanted to start with a project structure, because when you're entering data into the database, you should always follow this workflow. You start at tier 1, enter tier 2, move to tier 3. Alyssa can show you this when we go through the example. Because if you start at tier 3 and try and work backwards, I'm not even sure if it's physically possible to do it, but it's possible that you might end up creating a record that can't or shouldn't actually exist based on the options. So always start at the top, tier 1, and then move your way down to through the list to make sure you're choosing the appropriate selections. So this here is the Excel document that I talked about. I know you can't see it. It's far too small. I have zoomed in shots later on, but I just wanted to give a overarching, this is what the document looks like. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but I'll use it anyway. So it's blocked off into those 4 groups that I mentioned in the structure. So activity, these are the options, land class, polygon data, polyline data, point data. So that's all part of the project description. And then we have the main function over here. So this is a super powerful reference document. I'm actually going to pop out of the PowerPoint and open the actual live document. And why it's really helpful is for most of the options here, except for the ones that are pretty self-intuitive, you can actually find the definition of what that means by hovering over the cell. So any of the cells that have the little red triangles in the corner provide the definition or the terminology or the explanation for when and why you should choose that classification. So if you have a project and you're not sure, or if you're new to the database and you're just learning, this is a great tool to have open while you're entering your project to familiarize yourself and learn the flow and when should I choose this option over this option and that sort of thing. So I'm going to pop back to the PowerPoint. So that's the main reference document. Highly recommend having that easily accessible. You might choose to print it off and have it handy at your desk. But if you do that, you won't have the definitions available, but you'd still have the structure and the flow. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to, a little bit more in detail, look at these chunks, the 4 categories, and what those structures are. So the first one is the activity. So this is how you classify whether a project is new, by their own hand, or conserved. And that's the tier 1 selection. So the first thing you need to do is select one of these 3 options. And then depending on which of those you choose, you will then in tier 2 have the subsequent drop-down options. So the options for new and by their own hand in tier 2 are the same, but you'll see if you choose conserved existing, the tier 2 selection is different than the other ones. So it's important to choose tier 1 first. I'm not going to read these. I've included them in the deck for easy reference if you want to look at this again after. But these are the definitions that have been pulled out of the classification document that I just showed you. And so it gives an explanation as to, okay, I'm not sure if this is new or by their own hand, or, you know, those ones are a little bit more straightforward. Most people can figure out the difference between those. But creation, enhancement, and restoration sometimes can be a bit tricky. So there's some guidance there in terms of when you should choose each of those options. The second group is the land class, and this is just a single tier. And this is how we determine where the project exists on the landscape, sort of on a watershed basis. So the options are upland, wetland related, upland, other water body related, upland not related to water, riparian water body related, riparian other water body related, and then just water body. So that's the tier 1 option. And the definitions for these, again, not going to read them, far too much text, just included for future reference if you want to refer back, are in the Excel document. And these ones are a little bit subjective to a degree. So there should be a clear difference between upland and riparian and water body, but within those 3 categories, you know, upland not related to water, upland other water body, upland wetland, there might be a little bit of gray area. There might be a bit of gray area between when does riparian transition into upland, you know, like those sort of pieces. So that's where you can refer to these definitions, get a better idea, and then use your best judgment. You guys are the ones out on the landscape. You're the ones working with the farmers. You know your areas. You guys are, you know what you're doing. So use your best judgment as to where within these upland and riparian categories it feels. You know, if you have a defensible and solid reason for categorizing it as that, then that's fine. Now, moving on to the big one, the most selections, is the project descriptions for polygon projects. And this one is where it's very important to make sure you're following the correct workflow from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3 to make sure you have the right project selections. So tiers 2 to 4 options are dependent on what you've selected previously. And the first selection, tier 1, your general project type is your ecotype. So is it a tree and shrub project? Is it a grassland project, a water body project, or a modified ag? And depending on which of those you choose, your tier 2 option will provide you with different drop downs. And again, you can see that all of these options here have the little red triangle from the Excel document. This is a screen grab. So on the Excel document, you can hover over each of these to see the definition and decide which is the best fit for your project. And then you would follow that on to tier 3. And then tier 4 is an optional field in the database. But if your project does require a little bit more narrowing down, I guess, or specificity, or you want to capture that, then you can capture that in tier 4, which is also a dropdown. I just want to note in tier 3, we have very recently added a new classification, and that is called riparian vegetation. And that is available under both the tree and shrub category and under the grassland category. And this was added in based on some feedback from coordinators that there wasn't really anything that captured that riparian area that's been, fenced off and enhanced and protected, but no additional planting was done. So, like native grass mixes weren't planted, or there wasn't a tree planting project done in that area. There was already existing vegetation that's being enhanced because it's not going to be grazed and trampled and all of that. But there wasn't really a classification that captured that. So we've added that in. So riparian vegetation in both tree and shrub and grassland. So hopefully that will provide a bit of clarity and a more appropriate option for some of the projects that you're working in. So I'm not going to show all the definitions for all of those polygon options, but you can find them two places. One, which I've already spoke about, is by hovering in the Excel document over the cells to get the definitions there. Or second, we actually have a terminology definitions dictionary document, if you will, and that's available in the cookbook in the same folder. So you go to the cookbook, program delivery, and then database, and then right in the database folder is a document called ALUS Terminology Definitions, and it has all sorts of definitions about all sorts of things in the database and the rest of delivering ALUS, and it includes all the definitions for every aspect of the classification scheme. So yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, Casey. Ken just had a couple of questions in the chat here. He said, isn't that sustainable grazing management or delayed grazing, etc.? And sorry, Ken, I had missed when you put those in exactly, so I don't know what you were talking about.
I'm assuming he means the riparian areas. The riparian.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think the classification for this, maybe Christine could speak more to it. She was the one who brought it forward. Was for the areas that have been fenced off, I guess. I'm not sure. It's more came out of Alberta, so I'm not super familiar with the project types, but maybe Christine can provide a bit more of an explanation.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it can be a little bit of a nuanced thing that is based on your impression on the ground. It actually came from a request from Parkland because there were some projects that are being managed very specifically for the riparian aspect of things, and so like they might get grazed every now and then or whatever, but it's really being managed specifically as a riparian area and for that purpose, as opposed more to adapting your grazing strategy. If that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. We can circle back to that at the end, Ken, if you want more discussion or clarification on that. So yeah, just to wrap this slide up, the definitions that are in the Word document, the terminology document, are the same definitions that are in the classification scheme reference document. So you can find the definitions for these classifications in either of those two places.
So I just want to interrupt and go back to Ken because that's my thing. Because I think that's a pretty important question. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like almost always when you're thinking about where to allocate or how to classify a project, you want to think of sort of the end result. So like Christine said, managing for riparian health. So you're not in this case, it's really not about changing a grazing habit. It's about managing for riparian health. So yeah, cows might go in there and graze once in a while, but the purpose and goal is riparian health, as opposed to this new grazing protocol that we're bringing in. And so that kind of helps you with all your classifications. Like, what's the end goal? Because what were we talking about just the other day on the Hub Manager channel, guys? It was like trees and grass. You've got a mix of things, but ultimately, where are you heading? Like, are you heading to a tree situation? Hedgerows that are mixed with grass, shrubs, and trees are hedgerows. So that's like more tricky. And that's why we've added that new piece. But Is that help a bit more, Ken, what you were asking?
Yeah, I don't know if we want to spend much time on this right now, but if we do, yeah.
I had a slide later on about sort of discussing some of the gray areas and the subjectivity of some of it. So
okay, then let's hold it.
Yeah.
But let's definitely discuss it on this call because I think it's important.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, so same situation for the polyline data. So again, follow your tiers. You have your control structure, alternative watering system. This I've accidentally screen grabbed some of the point projects, but so you have your two objects for control structures and alternative watering system for your line project. And then you have your subsequent tier 2 and tier 3 options for those projects as well. So same as everything else, just follow the flow, check your definitions. Same situation, this is where you can find the information for those. Again, just included for future reference if you're referring back to the slide deck. And then for point projects, same situation. Habitat nesting structures, control structures, alternative watering system, and animal structures. Previously, there were point projects that were signage. That option has been removed, and I believe that was discussed at last month's database call. But as a refresher, if you have historic signage point projects in your database, Kevin's team will reach out to you, and they will move that data into the new location in the database. So just refresher on that. Same situation, tier 2, tier 3 for these options. Tier 4 is optional. I think there's a text entry if you want to record some more specific information. In the same place for how to find the definition. So for all of these things, I will say that, like I said, we created this classification many years ago, and we have made some adjustments over the few years. But if, like has recently happened, like what Christine said with Parkland, there's projects you're doing, or you're doing new types of projects that aren't really adequately described by the classification scheme, whether it's polygon or a point or a line, please let your hub manager know and have that conversation, and they'll bring it to the rest of the team, and we will determine whether we need to add an additional classification there. And I will say that I haven't specifically talked about the modified agriculture because we are currently discussing how those classifications will relate to our grazing pilot that we're doing out west right now. So there might be some modifications or additions to how that those will be classified, and we will communicate those changes very clearly to the when or if they are implemented. So how does this relate to the database? Entirely, it entirely relates to the database. It only exists because the database exists. So you should refer to your classification scheme when you're entering project data in the database. As a new user, I would recommend referring to it anytime you're entering projects. If you are an experienced user, I would recommend refreshing yourself, maybe, at the beginning of the year. Database entry tends to go in waves, and maybe you haven't entered project data in a few months. So maybe at the beginning of the field season or the beginning of when you're really going to be entering your project data, you just do a bit of a refresher and review those references and familiarize yourself. You can print off a copy of the Excel document and or the terminology document and have those handy on your desk, or you can just bookmark the location or whatever and have the digital references really handy. So if you're a little bit stuck, you can refer back to that. So this is the gray area. So we don't live in a black and white world, not everything is this or that. There is gray area and there's subjectivity. And especially when you're working on natural systems where there are not hard lines and clear cutoffs and that sort of thing. So what if you're not really sure what the right classification is? Or what if you're debating between two and you don't really know? So I've included a couple examples here, but there are more. What I mentioned earlier in terms of upland, wetland related, upland not related to water, those sort of things. That piece is obviously very much up to your discretion based on the guiding definitions that we've given you. Nobody's going to come out, and if you're at a project tour, nobody's going to say, well, you said that was upland water body related, but it's really wet. Like, nobody's going to do that. So it's subjectivity to a degree for those. And then a couple examples here. So this is a common practice in the East. Project will be putting down some native grasses and then planting bare root tree stock into them. So the question is, well, I planted grasses, but I'm also planting trees. So is this a grassland project or is this a tree and shrub project? And this is where the guidance that we want to share with you is what Lynn alluded to a couple minutes ago, is we want to consider what the mature result of this project will be and what the project is being managed for. So in this particular example, was the grass seeded as a way of controlling weed competition and to provide some interim habitat while the trees mature. And the end goal is really for those trees to mature and this to become a, like a woodland forested area. In that case, you would want to classify this as a tree and shrub. Was it predominantly grasses and there's just a few small pockets of trees scattered over a large area, and the end result is, you kind of want it to be a savanna habitat, then that would probably be more appropriate to classify as a grassland. And so you're looking at the end result, and you're also looking at the management activity. So what direction have you given the landowner for how they should manage this project? In this example, are they managing it for tree growth and survival, or are they managing it to maintain a grassland habitat? So when you consider both of those things together, it can help clarify what the overarching classification should be. So that's a polygon project description example. And then as an activity example, this has come up and been brought to our attention a few times as well. So, agriculture is quite predominant, has been around for quite a long time, but historically, there used to be a lot of wetlands in this area, but they haven't existed there in 100 plus years. But we're going to put a wetland back on the landscape. Is that creation? Am I creating a new wetland, or am I restoring a wetland that used to exist 100 years ago? Use your best judgment. There's no right answer here. It's, if you have some records or cool old maps or some sort of modeling that shows you that this definitely absolutely used to be a wetland and you're really confident, then you could say restoration. You could say creation because you don't know. There's really no right answer. Do you have a reasonable and defendable rationale for why you chose one over the other? Then that's great. So those are just two examples. And then ultimately, if you're not sure and you're really in a conundrum about it, talk to your hub manager. They'll have a conversation with you, work through it, figure out what the rationale for various options are, and decide on what the best route is. So, let's do that right now with Ken's question. So let's discuss that. Is this riparian area in the middle of a pasture? You got a wetland that you've got 10, 20 meters of pasture around it. Would you consider that riparian vegetation, or would you consider that sustainable grazing? Let's discuss. Anyone? Thoughts?
I think if we're thinking outcome, it's riparian. That's the mature result of this project is riparian.
Yeah, I think there's two situations here from my view. Again, not working in Alberta, so take it with a grain of salt. I think that if you were enrolling the entire pasture into sustainable grazing or AMP, then, you know, you could enroll right up to whatever, a sustainable grazing. That could be one option. But if you're only enrolling those areas, like say it's conventionally grazed, but you're just enrolling the riparian as a protected zone, maybe that's riparian vegetation. I don't know, that's one thought. Could be wrong. It's subjective. Christine or Paige from out west, a little more experience there. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, another kind of contribution to the gray area, if your project maintenance includes helping your participant develop a grazing management plan to enhance that space. Counterpoint, you know, it could fall into the sustainable grazing.
So I think this holds firm to this, what is it being managed for, right? If the whole area that you're enrolling is being managed for sustainable grazing, then that's probably what you should enroll those acres as. But if you're only enrolling, you know, if you're enrolling it and you're managing it to improve the riparian area specifically without a grazing component specifically, then maybe it's the riparian. I think it could be either, depending on the situation.
Yeah, I agree. Like if grazing is going to be a really significant component of it, like they're going to graze it every year, maybe a couple times a year, that kind of thing, then sustainable grazing makes probably the most sense to me. But if it's being set aside for riparian protection, and like maybe you'll throw the cows in there every couple of years or something to keep the biomass down or something, but you're really managing that area as a riparian area and like trying to avoid all like compaction and pugging and hummocking and like all of that kind of stuff, then to me that's more of a riparian project.
I guess.
Okay, if everybody is kind of good with that, we can move on. The next portion is to do the live walkthrough. I just want to ask the group, would you prefer to do a bit of a Q&A right now or following the database demonstration?
I'd like to ask a question. I was wondering, before you do all those classification, if there was like a minimal surface for a project, because like let's say you have a really small wetland that was built by the owner like a couple of years ago, and then you want to add the riparian area around, like do you necessarily separate that as two different projects, or if they're really small you put it into only one thing, because then it's kind of hard to classify it into either wetland or riparian area, or is there a minimum surface you choose or not really? You try to always classify like for the use and result of the project independently from the surface.
Yes, so there's not a minimum size. So in that example you've given, that would be, you should be entering that as two separate. So there's the actual like wetland water body component, and then there's the riparian component would be a separate project. And the reason we do that is because sometimes there are funders and whatnot out there who really are only interested in the water body component, which, I mean, we know the riparian has a huge influence on that, but sometimes they just want the water. So that's why we have them separated out. But we have projects that are like super tiny in a lot of places, like 0.1 acres and stuff. So any other questions right now? If not, I will pass it off to Alyssa. She can go live to the database.
It's very exciting going live to the database, guys. So I'm going to share my screen now. I'll give you a walkthrough of how to enter a project. Is that right, Casey?
Yes.
Okay. So just like our old database, it has a logic to it that goes downward from participants to projects. So in order to add a project, you go to the contract. You'd go to the person's contract that you wanted to. In this case, there's only one, so I'll just use this. And if you scroll down in the contract section to this section, it says edit, add a new project, view projects. You can add a new project, and it's pretty simple to do so. So it will automatically generate a project number like the old database did. And then you can choose your start year. If it's just an expression of interest, you would put that. If you have already received permission from your PAC, they've approved it, then you can do approve to proceed. Once it's established, you would do established. So usually at the beginning, it's one of these two, depending if you had it approved last year or not. So I'm going to just say approve to proceed. The active date, you would select from the calendar. And this is when the project was established. So let's just say April 15th. And the project inactive date would be the end of the contract.
The project is the date the project is removed from the program. So if it's not withdrawn or terminated, that field is blank.
Okay. Thanks, Casey. And then there's the first year. If there's a zero payment, which happens in rare cases, you would either select yes or no for that. But in this case, let's say no. And if it's a multi-year establishment, then you would want to select yes here, but we'll select no. So that means like if, it's established over 2 years. So then you could go through the initial estimated acreage. If it's approved to proceed, it's likely not going to have a confirmed acreage yet. So let's say that this project is a wetland project in a lowland area beside a creek. So the wetland is going to be 1 acre, you predict. And the payment rate is $150 per acre. And the estimated establishment is 12,000. Is there going to be fencing for this? Sure. Let's say that there's cattle in the area too. So we're going to have to put some fencing in at, let's say 500 feet. Project common name, wetland, and fencing. Is it a buffer? So length of riparian stream buffer. I'm gonna leave that there. Choose one. Cultivated, developed, natural, orchard, or pasture. So this area was pastured because there was cattle in the area. The watershed, you would put whatever watershed that it was in. So I'm just going to put Lower Thames. Does it impact, well, is there SAR? So let's see what it says. Hold on. So, is there SAR? Let's say yes. Does this benefit SAR? Yes, this would. SAR benefits. Maybe you could put Blandings, turtle, SAR sightings. We'll leave blank because we haven't seen anything yet. And any comments you had about the site you would put there. So then you'd scroll down to project description, and this is where it can get a little bit tricky, as Casey was saying. So this is going to be a new project because we're creating it with the landowner. If they had been creating it, if they had created it already, it would have been by their own hand. If there was a wetland there already, it would have been existing. So in this case, let's say there was historic imagery of wetlands being in this area. And when you started digging, you found, you know, evidence of a creek bed or something like that, or you found mussels or something like that, that could indicate that there was possibly something there. So we would put restoration in that case. It's not a point or a line, it's a polygon because it's a wetland feature. It would be a water body. It's a wetland. And in this case, I'm just gonna call it a shallow open water. So it doesn't really fit into being a sediment pond. It's not ephemeral because it would be holding water all year long, not just in the spring. If you were managing it or planting species that made it a marsh, like lots of cattails, or that was kind of the area that it was in, you could call it a marsh. Bog and fen are very specific, so you'd want to be clear on those definitions. And, you know, you could call it a swamp if you were planting trees around it and you were giving it more of those types of features. So you just want to be looking into those definitions. So let's say it's shallow open water. And then the tier 4 doesn't seem to fit in this case, so we're not going to put anything there. The land class. So it would be a water body. I could see this maybe potentially being confusing though, if you were considering it a riparian. You could probably consider it a riparian wetland because it's beside a creek. So
Water body. Water body.
Water body.
Yeah, you can't, if it's a wetland, you can't have it as any other classification.
So there, it's that one you need to have it as a water body. No, it could be misleading. Make sure it's a water body. And then you would select what the actual purpose of the creation is. So habitat creation, or is it for erosion control? Is it for flood control? Or is it to act as a riparian buffer? So let's say in this case, it was for flood control because it's right beside the creek, where there would normally be a lot of flooding in the spring and there is cattle there. And then is it a buffer? See, in this case, would you consider it as a buffer or not a buffer if it's beside a creek?
With a wetland.
So it's not a buffer. Management input, low, moderate, or high. You know, it's a wetland. There might be invasive species that come in that could make it a bit harder, but I would say it's moderate. And then the whatever type of soil you have. So most of the time in that area, it would be like a silty clay. And is there a rodent risk? You know, maybe if in some cases there could be a risk of rodents kind of getting into the walls of the wetlands, but I think it's pretty low if it's a dugout, so I would say low. So is it everybody happy with that? In this scenario? And then I would create the project.
Can you give a little bit of this and stuff there, and show on the side there where it shows the classification once it's been created? So scroll down a little bit more. Up.
Yep.
So yeah, so right there on the right hand side it says feature data polygon. So starting there, you can see as you move down the tier 1, tier 2, and then tier 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's the flow of how the different selections have moved through for this project classification.
Perfect. And then from your projects, that's where you can access all of the other important entries like activity costs and monitoring, financial information, and species at risk. So just so you know, because it is like kind of at the bottom of the project screen, that's a really important section not to miss.
Awesome. Does anybody have any other questions? We have a few minutes left on the call.
There's a question from Becky in the chat about why was the wetland classification removed?
Not sure where you need that.
Well, it was in there. I think it was maybe under tier 2 or something. I'm not positive.
Hello.
If we go back in to edit that project, we should see what happened to the tier 2 data there. Could just be a missed mouse click kind of issue there.
There we go. So water body, wetland, shallow open water.
Make sure
And
that
let's go back and see now.
I'm not sure 100%, but what probably happened there was when Alyssa was choosing the land class and she selected riparian, it probably cleared the wetland option because you can't have a wetland that is a riparian classification. So.
Oh yeah, that's probably it. but it's there now, so. Good eye.
I see a hand. Kim, is that you? The question?
Yes, it's me. Thank you. Now I got to get my hand down so it's not. I guess it's more of a comment. I would handle that. I would make 2 projects out of that, and maybe I'm just being picky here, but I wouldn't include the fencing in this portion because that would be its own individual project.
Yes, that's correct, Kim. So the wetland, the actual water body that we've classified here would be one project, and then the fencing would be a polygon project, which would be classified completely
Right.
separately as a new project.
So just a matter of clarification for newer people.
Yes, thank you. Okay, any other questions, comments? If not, we can wrap up, but if you do, we have a few minutes left.
All right. Somebody's popping up in the chat. Yeah, not hearing any more questions. So we can wrap up today's call. Thanks everybody for joining. We'll be sharing Casey's slide deck and we'll make the recording for today's call available as well.
Thanks everybody very much for coming today. Hopefully it was helpful.